The date, April 2nd, 2014. The place, Boquete, a little town high up in the mountains of Panama, beloved by retired expats and hikers.
A quiet place, where nothing much happens. The peaceful atmosphere in the little town will not last, though, and 12 years later the echoes of what is about to happen can still be felt resonating through the quiet streets. A mystery which until this very day remains unsolved. This is the first day that 25-year-old Eileen is all alone in charge of the language school Spanish by the River. And she's about to embark with 2 Dutch students and the Panamanian host, Feliciano, on a tour to a strawberry farm in the mountains outside the city. Few people know this area as well as 58-year-old Feliciano, who is the preferred guide for all tours arranged by the language school, a job he has now been doing for more than 14 years. But although Eileen is waiting by the side of the road, there is no sign of the 2 Dutch girls. "I thought the Dutch were always so punctual," Feliciano jokes, when, after 10 minutes, there is still no sign of the 2 other girls. "Although not so punctual as Germans." "They aren't coming," Eileen remarks not long afterward, looking rather worried. She arranged this tour the previous morning, after Kris and Lisanne asked her for it. Logically, the 2 Dutch girls should know. "Perhaps they overslept," Feliciano remarks as the 2 of them walk to the house of Miriam, the host family where Kris and Lisanne are staying. But when they arrive at the little bungalow, there is a deep silence. Miriam, her husband, and her oldest daughter are at work, and the 2 younger children are off to school. Eileen and Feliciano call out for Kris and Lisanne, knocking on the front door and on the bedroom window of the 2 girls, but there is no response. In the end, there is no other option but to call Miriam, who seems just as surprised that the 2 girls aren't responding, and who then asks them to check inside, telling them where the spare key of the house is hidden. As they walk through the narrow alleyway, there is an eerie silence, and when they arrived in the kitchen, the breakfast, which Miriam prepared for her 2 guests in the morning, is still on the table, untouched. "The moment I stepped into that room, I knew that nobody had been sleeping here for the past night," Feliciano will later declare. Kris and Lisanne are gone. "Last night, I waited till 2300 for them with diner, but they never came back," Miriam declares when they call her. "I did not see them in the morning, but I thought they had arrived late in the night and were still sleeping." Nobody has any idea where the 2 Dutch girls may have gone to. The quiet little town of Boquete is not exactly known for its nightlife, and Kris and Lisanne did not know anyone in town, having just arrived here 3 days ago. Judging by the shoes right below the bed, Kris and Lisanne apparently rapidly changed their shoes for hiking boots before leaving the room, never to return. But there does not seem to be any other indication as to where they may have gone to, or at what time they left. Much later, though, when pictures of the empty bedroom start spreading across the internet, online sleuths discover a little card lying on the bed of Kris, right next to her leather purse. The business card from Feliciano. "We need to go to the police," Feliciano remarks, according to his affidavit, but Eileen objects. "We need to give them more time. They may come back soon." In her homeland, Germany, you cannot report people missing until they have been gone for more than 24 hours, and for all they know, a similar rule exists in Panama. Once again, according to his affidavit, Feliciano then mentions they should tell Ingrid, the head of the school, or Marjolein, the previous manager, but once again Eileen objects, stating it is better to wait a bit. Young and totally inexperienced, Eileen is being placed into a hopeless situation. She is just an apprentice, and placing her in charge of the school was only a temporary solution to cover for an emergency in Costa Rica. And now, on the very first day of this assignment, she is facing an impossible situation. There are no protocols in place at the language school on how to deal with a missing student. She does not speak Spanish, And apart from Feliciano, she knows nobody in Boquete, having arrived here only 3 days ago. But we cannot wait here either, Feliciano comments. He knows the owner of the strawberry farm is a rather impatient man, and by now more than half an hour has passed. As to what happens next, though, the official account differs from what is often stated in the media. Contrary to what is usually written, Feliciano did not take Eileen on the scheduled trip to the strawberry farm, which would have been useless anyway. Kris and Lisanne were the only two paying customers for this trip, as Feliciano had earlier agreed to take Eileen along free of charge. They do drive to the farm at Alto Kiel, though, in order to tell the owner that the appointment is canceled. And from there, they then continue to the start of the Quetzales Trail to search for Kris and Lisanne. The exact reason on why they start by searching the Quetzales Trail has never become fully clear, but most likely it's simply because this trail is in the same direction, and at Alto Kiel, they are already halfway to Quetzales. The route to Quetzales also takes them past two other well-known trails, the Pipeline Trail and Las Tres Cascades, both of them places which Kris and Lisanne have actively been searching information on during the past days. It is not known, however, if Feliciano and Eileen stop and ask at these trails. In later interviews, Eileen denies that she overheard Kris and Lisanne talking of any hiking plans, or mention any specific trails. I had absolutely no idea where they might have gone, she will emphasize. Unlike the Pianista Trail, the Quetzales Trail has an entrance fee, and at the ranger station near the entrance, Feliciano talks with the park ranger, asking if anyone has seen two Dutch girls enter the trail the previous day, but there is no record of such visitors, and nobody remembers any Dutch girls. As he has an appointment in David for the afternoon, Feliciano then delivers Eileen back at the language school, asking her to call him as soon as there is any news regarding the two missing girls. Although there is no official account of this, it is probably during this time, all alone at the language school, that Eileen decides to check the browser history on the school's computers to see if Kris and Lisanne studied information on any specific trails. Apart from Kris and Lisanne, there is only one other language student staying at the school, who is from Liechtenstein, so it should not be too difficult to find out which searches were performed by the Dutch girls. As she will later attempt to explain to the police, it is during this search that she finds several references to the Pianista Trail. Late in the afternoon, when there is still no sign of the two Dutch girls, Eileen realizes that there is no other option left but to call Ingrid, the head of the school, to inform her of the two missing girls. As to what happens next, there are two different stories. According to one account, Ingrid then instructs Eileen to call the parents of Kris and Lisanne. But it seems rather weird that in such a situation, the head of the school would leave it to an apprentice to contact the parents. The other story, which seems more logical, is that Ingrid tells Eileen to try and call the two missing girls. Kris and Lisanne both carry mobile phones, and it is rather weird that until this moment, nobody seems to have thought of simply calling their phones. But were the mobile phone numbers of Kris and Lisanne ever recorded at the language school? To this very day, this is not clear. But if they were anywhere in the records, Eileen was unable to find them. Instead, she calls the only number which she can find, which happens to be the number of Lisanne, her parents. In Holland, at that moment, it is past midnight, in the early morning of April 3rd, and Lisanne, her parents, have just gone to bed. The conversation which follows is somewhat confusing. According to Denny, the mother of Lisanne, a young woman asks her, "Do I speak with Lisanne? We are searching for Lisanne." "No," answers Lisanne's mother. "Lisanne is in Panama." She hangs up, confused. Then she calls back and hears the terrible news that her daughter did not spend the night at their host family and seemingly did not come back from a hike. As we have seen in the first episode of this series, the parents of Lisanne then call Kris's parents, as well as the travel agency which arranged the holiday and the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, before heading to the police to file a missing persons report. Meanwhile, in Panama, Eileen calls the only other person she knows in Boquete, the guide Feliciano, who hurries back to the language school to take Eileen to the police station and to assist her with reporting the two girls missing. By the time they arrive at the police station, it is 1900 hours in the early evening of April 2nd, 31 hours since the two Dutch girls were last seen. In a situation where time might be of utmost importance, a full day has been lost. And still, things aren't going as planned, as the police officer needs the IDs of the two Dutch girls in order to file a report, and neither Feliciano nor Eileen has this information with them, forcing them to head back to Miriam's house to search for the missing papers. For the second time that day, Feliciano and Eileen enter the bedroom of the girls, this time accompanied by Miriam, as they search for the missing IDs. They manage to find Kris her passport and a copy of Lisanne her ID, and after they take these documents back to the police station, the missing persons report is finally completed. By that time, it is 21:30 in the evening in Panama, and by now it is too late to start a search, so Kris and Lisanne will have to go through another night in the jungle. Half an hour later, at Amersfoort in the Netherlands, where it is 5 o'clock in the morning, the parents of both girls arrive at the police station to file a missing persons report as well, this time with the Dutch police. The Dutch report is then instantly forwarded to Interpol as well as to the Panamanian police and the Dutch embassy in Panama. According to a story which is often repeated in media and even recorded in one of the books on this case, Feliciano then heads to the office of Sinaproc, the civil defense agency, early the next morning, convincing the 10 men who are present there to urgently follow him up the Pianista Trail to search for the two Dutch girls. This story would later raise many questions with internet sleuths, when they rightfully questioned how Feliciano could know the girls had gone up the Pianista Trail. With all due respect for the elderly guide, we can now conclude from the official reports that this heroic story is simply not true, or at least it skips several chapters. Sinaproc and Sinafront, the border police, who would work together on this search, handled the case according to the book. So, before they ran off to start a search, they first conducted an investigation, visiting Miriam's house in the early morning of April 3rd, where they interviewed Miriam and her daughters and searched the bedroom of Kris and Lisanne.
Nosotros al inicio de la operación también pudimos darnos cuenta que en el cuarto donde ellas estaban todavía se encuentra el cepillo de dientes, su pasta de dientes, su artículo de aseo personal, lo que nos indica a nosotros que ellas no iban a una gira larga, sino que iban a una gira posiblemente muy corta del día.
Miriam tells them that she does not believe Kris and Lisanne to have taken off on a hike, because Lisanne had been sickly and they did not bring their jackets or passports with them. Miriam also says that the young women had arrived on Saturday, the 29th, and that she had not seen them since Monday afternoon. The head of Personeria Boquete, Rafael Guerrero, later tells the press that the Civil Defense Agency overstepped boundaries and falsified a possible crime scene. Sinaproc had conducted witness interviews on its initiative and searched the missing girl's room without authorization and before the room was taped off and secured. They also did not stick to the strict forensic rules when touching the girls' belongings. Arturo Alvarado defends his team's actions in the press by emphasizing that there was an absolute urgency to spring into action at the time, and the case was then still considered a missing persons case, not a crime investigation. The police later conducts their own search of the bedroom, reportedly taking fingerprints and DNA samples. Although, by now, many people have already been inside the room, and nobody remembers exactly what it looked like in its original state. Meanwhile, after their investigation at Miriam's house, the Cineproc teams as well as the police proceed to the language school, where they interview Eileen. An interview which almost certainly runs into trouble, due to the fact that Eileen speaks barely a word Spanish. Although they published a summary of the interview with Miriam, hardly anything has ever been said about the interview of Eileen, and the official Spanish text has never been published. Which probably gives an indication on how difficult this interview went. Nevertheless, Cineproc draws an important conclusion from this interview, summarized in a sentence which, even today, still puzzles everyone researching this case. Despite the language problems, Eileen seems to have succeeded in drawing the attention of Cineproc to the browser history of the computers. Or perhaps Cineproc themselves came up with this idea, discovering the searches for the Pianista trail, an important clue in the investigation. But what is meant with the 1300 hours? Does she mean that at 1300, Kris and Lisanne were searching on the computer for the Pianista trail? Or does she mean that she herself last saw Kris and Lisanne at 1300? And at which day? At the time, the statement was interpreted as Eileen having seen Kris and Lisanne for the last time on Tuesday, April 1st, at 1300 hours. However, years later, in an interview for the book Still Lost in Panama, Eileen states she last saw the two Dutch girls at 1300 on Monday, March 31st, not April 1st. Sadly, though, she never seems to have made any attempt to correct this wrong interpretation of her statement. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, Judith, the head of the Dutch travel agency where Kris and Lisanne booked their trip, makes an angry phone call to Ingrid, the head of the language school, blaming her for leaving a young apprentice all alone in control of the school at Boquete during such a crucial period when it is only a matter of time before all of this will be in the newspapers. Realizing the school cannot afford bad press, Ingrid rushes to Boquete on April 5th, but in her eagerness to get in control of the story, she only makes matters worse.
Het laatste moment is echt 1:10 geweest dat een lerares hun heeft gezien en dat een medewerkster die in het kantoor zat ze weg hebben zien lopen.
So now, suddenly there are two people who have seen Kris and Lisanne leave the language school at 1300 on April 1st. Some office clerk, by which she probably means Eileen, and a mysterious teacher. For more than 12 years, people have been trying to find out who this teacher was and what she actually saw. But apart from the story, which Ingrid keeps repeating, there is nothing. Neither Cineproc nor the police have any knowledge of a teacher, and this person was never interviewed by either of them. So, all we basically have is a young apprentice who does not speak Spanish and who became overwhelmed by the situation, and a head of the school who is very eager to get in control without allowing herself any time to do real research, and an imaginary teacher who was most probably the result of total confusion and hurried statements. What more can possibly go wrong? Well, we can put this vague and incorrect information on flyers and posters which we distribute everywhere in Boquete, which is exactly what the school organization does the next couple of days, with the first flyers being distributed by Eileen and Sigrid on April 3rd, and larger billboards appearing from April 6th onward. So now we have basically three organizations working on this case: the police and Cineproc, which, as we have already seen, are not working optimally together and who are accusing each other of obstructing the research, and the school organization, led by Ingrid, who seem to be conducting a complete independent search and who are promising reward money and issuing press statements without properly consulting police or Cineproc. There is a very good reason why, in cases like this, the police is often reluctant to give too much information early on in the research. People very quickly become influenced by what they read and hear. And if you depend on witness information, it is of top priority to prevent these witnesses from altering their statements based on things they have read in the press.
The brain abhors a vacuum. Under the best of observation conditions, the absolute best, We only detect, encode, and store in our brains bits and pieces of the entire experience in front of us. And they're stored in different parts of the brain. So now when it's important for us to be able to recall what it was that we experienced, we have an incomplete, we have a partial store. And what happens? Below awareness, with no requirement for any kind of motivated processing, the brain fills in information that was not there, not originally stored, from inference, from speculation, from sources of information that came to you as the observer after the observation. But it happens without awareness such that you aren't even cognizant of it occurring. It's called reconstructed memories. It happens to us in all the aspects of our life all the time.
So what do you think will happen if you tell everyone in town that the girls were last seen on April 1st at 1300 at the language school and then ask for witnesses? In the previous episode of this series, we have already seen how one witness near the Pianista restaurant originally claimed to have seen the girls on March 31st, but who was then told that this could not be true as it must have been April 1st. Another example is the guide Plinio, who originally stated he had seen Kris and Lisanne on April 1st at 12 o'clock, halfway up the Pianista trail, but who later withdrew his statement as the girls could not have been there at that time. So, why didn't Eileen correct her misunderstood or wrong statement before she and Sigrid started handing those first flyers out? Could it be she somehow convinced herself that the date and time had to be correct? Or was there some other reason why she preferred the real story to remain hidden? Sadly, we will probably never know, as Eileen seems to be telling a different story at every subsequent interview. Another weird insight in the workings of Eileen's mind comes the next day when the American expat Lee Zeltzer writes on the local internet forum. I spoke with Eileen at Spanish by the River in Boquete, who confirmed that the girls are missing, that they told no one where they were going, but they think from brochures and the internet sites they are reading, they were heading toward the Quetzales Trail, or someplace in that region of the mountains. So, here's the Quetzales Trail back again, the same place she originally visited with Feliciano on April 2nd. But just the previous day, Cineproc has retrieved information on the Pianista Trail from the computer memories, apparently on the insistence of Eileen. Has she already forgotten about this, or is she mixing the various trails up? And why did she and Feliciano initially go to the Quetzales Trail if she insists that she had absolutely no idea where the girls could have gone to and never overheard them say anything? Writing a coherent history of this case is not easy when one of the prime witnesses has such a chaotic memory. But we need to remember that we are talking here about a young and inexperienced apprentice who was thrown into a situation far beyond her capabilities to handle. And it is hard to understand why Ingrid, the head of the school, left Eileen to handle this situation all alone for 4 whole days before finally coming to her aid. Meanwhile, late in the morning of April 3rd, Cineproc and the police conduct a first interview with Feliciano, during which he says that he had agreed to serve as a guide on Wednesday the 2nd to a farm in the Boquete area and on Thursday the 3rd to the top of Volcan Baru, and when they did not show up on April 2nd at the agreed point, he went to Miriam's house to investigate the girls, and that is where they realized that the girls were not at the residence either.
De eerste die op zoek ging is Feliciano, een ervaren gids die de wandelpaden in de streek heel goed kent.
Yo fui la persona que por un evento que teníamos pendiente de hacer el día miércoles a las 8 de la mañana les fui a buscar, no las encontré y ya al darnos cuenta que no habían dormido en su casa donde habitualmente estaban con la familia, al día siguiente ya cuando se cumplían las horas que estipula la ley para poner denuncia fuimos.
Given the information on the Pianista Trail, which they have now retrieved from the language school, Cineproc then asks Feliciano to accompany a team along the Pianista Trail, while at the same time, teams are sent along the Quetzales Trail and to the volcano Baru to look for signs of the missing girls.
48 hours have passed since Kris and Lisanne were last seen, when finally the first search teams are on their way.
The team is barely started on their trip along the Pianista Trail, however, when the Sinaproc men receive orders to return to Boquete. According to some stories, they are told to prepare for the arrival of the Dutch ambassador the next day, while other stories say they are required to await the arrival of their commander and further reinforcements from the Panamanian capital. Well aware that time is of the essence, Feliciano continues alone along the trail, asking everyone he meets if they have seen two foreign girls walking up the trail on April 1st. And this time, he is lucky, for at the very start of the trail he meets two women, both of whom claim to have seen Kris and Lisanne. Oliva de Cam, whom we have seen in the previous episode of this series, and Martina.
Cuando la saludaron.
Yo trabajo en esto sembrando plantas y yo estaba aquí cuando la chica pasó.
¿Cómo sabes que era las dos?
Bueno, porque andaban dos muchachas juntas, se fue. Entonces cuando entre 3 días viene el guía que es Feliciano González, viene, me pregunta y me trae el foto, ahí donde que me di cuenta que era ella lo que había yo visto.
¿Y qué te acuerdas de ella? ¿Qué fue lo que viste de ella?
Bueno, como yo estaba aquí, yo no reparo la persona, bueno, solamente veo la cara porque ella pasó y me dijo.
¿Te saludaron?
Sí, sí. Y entonces no reparé más, no reparo porque esto es un sendero de los turismos y...
¿Iban solas?
Solo, sí.
¿Viste entrar algún carro o algo?
Bueno, eso sí, no.
One interesting point about the Martina interview is that she claims that Feliciano walked by 3 days after she had seen the girls. But Feliciano walked by on April 3rd, and Kris and Lisanne became lost on April 1st, which should be 2 days, unless she actually saw the two Dutch girls on March 31st, as we discussed in the previous episode. Another important aspect to keep in mind is that these statements were made before flyers and posters of the two missing girls were distributed. So, the two women cannot have been influenced by these. However, Feliciano himself had only met Kris and Lisanne once, claiming to have seen them from a distance, and he did not carry any pictures of the girls with him. So, there is no way to be certain if these early witnesses truly saw the right girls. However, to Feliciano at that moment, the most important aspect was that everyone he spoke to near the start of the trail had seen two girls go up the trail around 1600, and nobody had seen them return. What happens next is important, for, as we have seen in the previous episode, all of these early witness statements can be explained if we assume Kris and Lisanne took an earlier hike to the Pianista Trail on March 31st. Or, if two identical-looking Western girls took this same route in the late afternoon of April 1st. But the final witness statement cannot be explained by this theory, as it is too far up the mountain.
Het pad is steil en glibberig, maar niet erg moeilijk. Halverwege staat een boerderij.
El señor que vive aquí las vio subir
Aquí
en el sendero.
Lorenzo es guía de turismo y conoce todos los senderos de Boquete. Fue el último testigo que las vio.
Bueno, yo vi dos mujeres, dos personajes, así como dos mujeres, pues, pero yo estaba muy lejos donde estaban.
Y cuando usted las vio, ¿ellas hacia dónde iban?
Bueno, llevan casi de espalda hacia allá, hacia arriba.
The cabin of Lorenzo is too far up the Mirador to have been within range of anyone starting the trail at 1600, as the witnesses at the start of the trail claim. Inside the forest, it gets dark much earlier, and if they started the trail at such a late hour, they would be in near total darkness by the time they reach Lorenzo's cabin. But in his statement, Lorenzo does not mention darkness, meaning he must have seen them at a much earlier time, making him and Plinio some of the few known witnesses who probably saw Kris and Lisanne during their actual walk on April 1st. Sadly, many potential other witnesses never came forth, as it was widely reported that the girls left the language school in the afternoon, so many of those who saw them in the morning refrained from reporting, thinking, just like Plinio,
that they had seen some other girls.
Frequently calling out the names of the girls, Feliciano continues alone along the trail, well aware that after 2 days in the jungle, the conditions of the Dutch girls might have become critical. Too much time has been lost already, and now every hour counts. Although the trail is relatively easy to follow and the chance of getting lost is minimal, there are still places where an accident is possible, and there is always a small chance of encountering one of the several species of venomous snakes, or a bigger predator, like a mountain lion or jaguar. The biggest risk, in his opinion, however, is in the one thing which makes the Pianista Trail different from most of the other trails in the area. For the Pianista Trail does not have a real end. It continues all the way to the Atlantic coast, a journey of several days. Those who explore the Pianista Trail will have to decide for themselves when to turn back, and inexperienced hikers can easily get into a situation where they walk too far, unable to get back to the trailhead before dark.
De que la gente se salga del sendero afuera en el bosque, más bien la gente tiene que continuar caminando dentro del sendero. Lo que pudiera ser posibilidades para la gente como riesgo es que la gente no tome en cuenta la hora de regresar y continúe en el sendero, sí, pero no que se extravíe afuera del bosque, afuera del sendero.
Usually, though, those who do not manage to get back before dark safely return the next morning, after an uncomfortable night in the forest. The fact that Kris and Lisanne have not returned after 2 full days indicates something more serious must have happened. Expecting the girls to be very hungry when he finds them, Feliciano has stacked a large amount of fruit in his backpack. But as he continues along the trail, there is still no trace of the 2 missing girls. Failing to find Kris and Lisanne on the top of the Mirador, Feliciano continues down the Atlantic slopes until he reaches the paddocks. According to all the guides, this is as far as any unaccompanied tourist ever goes. One look at the wild terrain all around is enough to convince anyone to turn back. The paddocks is also one of the few places where a person can theoretically wander away from the trail. And as he scans the area, Feliciano checks the soft soil of the surrounding paddocks for imprints from hiking boots, finding none. If the girls have ever taken this trail, they aren't here anymore. According to some reports, Feliciano checks the wreckage of a small cabin, which used to exist within sight of the trail on the small paddock, finding no sign of the girls, before finally turning around and returning to Boquete. But as he walks back to Boquete, Feliciano is all too aware that time is running out. April 1st and 2nd have been clear and sunny, but by April 3rd, the weather is changing, and the first rain showers arrive, the preludes for the rainy season, which is about to start. On the Atlantic slopes of the Continental Divide, the rain, the mud, and the rising water levels will all too soon make further searches impossible or very dangerous. But as yet, Sinaproc is concentrating all search teams on the Pacific side of the divide. Although many of the witness statements seem to point toward the Pianista Trail, Sinaproc and Sinafront keep all options open, searching all trails in a wide area around Boquete, in what is soon to become the biggest search action in the history of Panama. To the north, the search actions stretch only just beyond the Mirador, though, with teams venturing not further than the second stream crossing. This is partly due to the incorrect assumption that the girls only left the language school at 1300 and cannot possibly have ventured further, but partly also due to the organizational structure of Sinaproc, which is divided in several districts. The northerly district from Sinaproc, which is governed from Bocas del Toro, does send out a team, though, which walks the complete Pianista Trail all the way from the Atlantic coast to Boquete, and is shown camping out at Finca Laureano on this tweet from April 7th. Although the quickly deteriorating weather hampers operations on several days, at least 2 and possibly 3 helicopter searches north of the Mirador are undertaken from April 5th onward, overflying the paddocks and the Culebra River. In terrain such as this, though, helicopter searches are of little use due to the very dense vegetation and the often strong winds and turbulence. For the same reason, no flights are ever undertaken at night.
The search on the Pacific slopes around Boquete is difficult enough already, but without a clear indication where the girls may have gone to, searching the terrain off-trail on the Atlantic slopes is an impossible task, certainly given the quickly deteriorating weather. Sinaproc keeps working on the assumption that the girls suffered some kind of accident, which prevented them from getting back to the trail.
Una de ellas pudiera ser que hayan sufrido algún tipo de accidente y hayan perdido el conocimiento y en el transcurrir de los días hayan perdido la capacidad de orientarse, continuar el camino o intentar retomar un camino y extraviarse del todo.
Hard as it is to perform a search from the air, on the ground it is even worse, with visibility close to zero due to the dense vegetation. Search dogs are used on all trails, including the Pianista, but unleashed dogs are not allowed on the Atlantic slopes beyond the Mirador, due to the dangerous terrain and the risk of snakes and other predators. The increasing rain and rising waters make it very hard to search for trails, though. On April 6th, one day after Ingrid, the head of the language school, finally arrives, Martin, the brother of Lisanne, arrives at Boquete.
Waarom ben je naar Panama gekomen?
Ja, dat hebben we natuurlijk uitgebreid met de familie overlegd. Wat zou ons aandeel zijn in Panama? Het voornaamste is dat wanneer die meiden gevonden worden, dat ze een bekend gezicht hebben om naartoe te komen.
De politie in Panama denkt nog altijd dat de vrouwen verdwaald zijn, maar sluit andere opties zoals een misdrijf niet uit. Gisteren werden er voor het eerst honden ingezet bij de zoektocht.
Ja, de zoekactie verloopt goed. We worden continu op de hoogte gehouden over wat ze aan het doen zijn. Echt grootste respect voor deze mensen. Die zijn elke dag de bergen ingegaan. Er zijn teams overnacht. Die zijn in de berg gebleven 's nachts, zodat ze de volgende dag weer verder konden zoeken. Het materiaal wat ze daarbij gebruiken, de helikopters, sinds gisteren de honden. Het ziet er allemaal heel indrukwekkend uit. En we weten gewoon dat ze er alles aan doen om die meiden te vinden.
That same day, on April 6th, the family announces a reward of $2,500 for anyone who has information which could lead to the safe return of the two girls. But although this results in lots of new tips, there is nothing which brings the solution of this case any closer. On April 8th, 2 days after Martin Froon, the parents of Kris Kremers arrive at Boquete as well. By now, everyone is convinced that every hour counts in the desperate search to find the two missing girls.
En wat is nu uw indruk van de zoekacties hier in Boquete?
Nou, ik ben er van onder de indruk, moet ik zeggen. Ik heb gisteren gesproken met de directeur van Sinaproc. En als ik zie hoeveel moeite men doet en hoeveel inzet van gespecialiseerde manschappen en politie-inzet die gepleegd wordt, vrijwilligers die helpen zoeken, iedereen die eigenlijk hier in Boquete en heel Panama mee bezig is. Dat voelt heel goed en ik ben ervan overtuigd dat alles uit de kast wordt gehaald door de autoriteiten hier om ze terug te vinden.
Nou zijn er allerlei geruchten in de omloop. Wat vindt u daarvan?
Ja, nou ja, wat vind ik daarvan? De meeste geruchten ken ik niet. Want dat volg ik niet allemaal wat er over gezegd wordt. Wat je natuurlijk krijgt is dat mensen gaan speculeren over wat zou er gebeurd kunnen zijn en wat dit en wat dat. En mensen gaan kleine plukjes informatie aan elkaar verbinden die wellicht niks met elkaar te maken hebben. En daar een verhaal van maken, omdat iedereen probeert tot een oplossing te komen. Dus wat ik volg is wat zeg maar de autoriteiten en wat als feiten vaststaat, om dat met name te volgen en uit te zoeken. En wat dat betreft worden hier ook alle scenario's opengehouden en wordt overal aandacht aan besteed.
Wat zijn het eigenlijk voor meiden? Zijn het wereldreizigers? Nemen ze veel risico?
Nee, ze nemen zeker niet veel risico. Het zijn verantwoordelijke meiden en verstandige meiden die op zich weten wat ze doen en goed overwogen hebben van waar ze naartoe zouden willen en waar ze vrijwilligerswerk zouden willen gaan doen. En dus via organisatie geboekt hebben. Dus op zich was alles geregeld en kon er weinig misgaan. Maar ja, blijkbaar is er dus toch iets misgegaan. En anders dan waren we niet een week aan het zoeken.
Meanwhile, independent of the official search by Cineproc and Cinefront, an ever-growing number of volunteers is searching the trails and forests outside Boquete, in an operation which is not always without risk, as all too many seem unaware of the dangers inherent in this terrain. In a post on his blog, Wild Explorer describes his own search of the slopes on the Atlantic side of the trail, between the Mirador and the first stream, on April 14th. The description of this search is important, as much later it was suggested by various persons that the girls may have fallen down one of these slopes while trying to make their way back toward the Mirador. With every passing day, the chances of finding the girls back alive become smaller. And by the end of the week, after covering almost 1,000 kilometers of trails during the biggest search operation Panama has ever undertaken, they are slowly running out of options. By all logic, the girls should have been found by now.
In this case, we don't have any track, any sign in the people of the girl still be here.
On Monday, April 14th, spokesman Elmer Quintero says, during a press conference, "If they were in the jungle of Boquete, we would have already found them." He rules out that the girls are out in the nature reserve. The intensive search is scaled down to a monitoring phase in the hands of the public ministry. Betsaida Pitti is put on the case. Her predecessor was specialized in rescue operations, whereas Pitti is specialized in criminal offenses.
For those who took part in the search operation, though, the failure to find even the slightest sign of the two girls will have profound effects on their lives. And the mystery of how this could have happened still lingers on. In episode 3 of this series, we will look at the criminal investigation, which was started together with the search operation and which continued after the search was scaled down.